The early morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the little cafe on Pine Street. It was one of those places that somehow stayed the same, while everything around it changed. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and tables that had seen thousands of coffee spills and elbows. The walls were decorated with local artwork and faded photos of the town from decades past. James took a deep breath before pushing open the door. The familiar chime of the bell above made his heart race with memories. It had been 5 years since he'd stepped foot in his hometown, and this cafe was once his favorite spot. Back then, he was just a broke college kid with big dreams and empty pockets. Now, at 34, he returned as the founder and CEO of PixelCore, a software company that had recently been valued at just over $3 billion. His casual outfit, dark jeans and a simple navy sweater, gave no hint of his wealth. The only luxury he allowed himself was a watch, a sleek timepiece that cost more than his first car. "Just one?" asked the young hostess, menu in hand. James nodded, following her to a corner table by the window. He liked corner tables. They gave him space to think, to work, to be invisible despite being recognized more and more these days. The financial magazines had started calling him the quiet genius of the tech world. "Your server will be right with you," the hostess said with a smile before walking away. James pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails without really reading them. His mind was elsewhere. Coming back to town hadn't been his plan. The call from his old professor asking him to speak at the university's business school graduation had been the push he needed. 5 years was a long time to stay away from the place that shaped him. "Good morning. Can I get you started with some coffee?" The voice stopped him cold. It was a voice he knew better than his own, one that had whispered dreams to him late at night, one that had laughed with him over inside jokes, one that had cried when he'd walked away. It was her voice. James looked up slowly, feeling like the world had suddenly shifted beneath him. There she stood, April, his college sweetheart, his ex-wife, the woman he'd left behind when his company started taking off, and she was pregnant. The rounded belly beneath her cafe apron was unmistakable. 6, maybe 7 months along. James felt his mouth go dry, his carefully constructed world of business meetings and investor calls suddenly meaningless. April's professional smile froze on her face as recognition dawned. The coffee pot in her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The cafe continued its morning bustle around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversations. But for James, everything faded to background noise. "April," he managed to say. How are you?" Such a ridiculous question. She was standing in front of him, wearing a waitress uniform, pregnant in the same small town he'd been so desperate to escape. How did he think she was? "I'm fine," she replied automatically, slipping into the practiced ease of someone used to keeping their personal life separate from customer service. "Coffee?" James nodded, watching as she poured the dark liquid into his cup with steady hands. Her hair was different now, shorter, with soft caramel highlights catching the morning light. The small freckle near her left eye that he used to kiss was still there. "Cream and sugar?" she asked. "All business now." "Black is fine," he said, though he'd switched to lattes years ago. Something about this moment demanded simplicity. April nodded and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. "I'll give you a minute with the menu." She turned to leave, and James found himself reaching out, almost touching her arm before pulling back. "April, wait." She paused, looking over her shoulder with eyes that held a storm of emotions. "I didn't know you still worked here," he said lamely, a small, tight smile. "I'm the manager now, actually. Just covering a shift today." Pride flickered across her face before being replaced by something harder to read. Before James could respond, another customer called for her attention and she was gone, moving between tables with practiced ease despite her pregnancy. James watched her, memories washing over him like waves. They'd met right here in this very cafe. He was a scholarship student studying computer science. She was working part-time to pay for her teaching degree. He'd spilled coffee on his laptop, panicking about losing his coding project. April had calmly helped him save the machine with quick thinking and a box of rice from the kitchen. 2 weeks later, they were inseparable. 2 years later, They were married in a small ceremony by the lake just outside town. They'd been so young, just 23, full of dreams and plans. They'd rented a tiny apartment above the hardware store, where James would code late into the night while April graded papers for her student teaching position. The birth of Pixel Core happened on their kitchen table. April had believed in him when his idea was just scribbles on napkins. She'd worked extra shifts so he could quit his job at the electronics store and focus on building his prototype. She'd been there through the rejection letters from investors, through the nights of doubt and frustration, and then suddenly, success. A venture capitalist saw potential in what James had created. Money came in, not a fortune, but enough to move operations to Silicon Valley. James saw his chance and took it. April couldn't leave mid-year from her first real teaching job. They'd do long distance just for a while, they promised each other. But a while turned into months. The company grew faster than anyone expected. James worked 18-hour days living on coffee and ambition. April's voice on the phone became more distant, her questions about when he was coming home more frequent. When she finally flew out to visit him, the gulf between them was already too wide. She saw a stranger in expensive clothes talking about stock options and market shares. He saw someone trying to pull him back to a small-town life when the world was finally opening up for him. The fight that ended it all wasn't even a big one. That was the saddest part. Just quiet words in a sterile, barely lived-in apartment. "I don't fit in your life anymore, do I?" she had asked. And he, fool that he was, had said nothing to convince her otherwise. The divorce papers came 3 months later. He signed them without reading them fully, too busy with the company's first major product launch. He sent a generous settlement that she never touched. And then he buried himself in work, building Pixel Core into the tech giant it was today. James took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste bringing him back to the present. April was at the counter now, laughing with an elderly customer. Her hand rested on her stomach in that protective way expectant mothers have. The simple gold band on her left hand caught the light. She was married again. Of course she was. Someone else had given her the family he'd been too ambitious, too selfish to consider. The thought sent an unexpected pang through him. The cafe door opened, letting in a gust of cool spring air, and a tall man with a friendly face. April's eyes lit up as she spotted him. The man headed straight for her, placing a gentle kiss on her cheek and a protective hand on her belly. James looked away, suddenly feeling like an intruder. He should leave, pay for the coffee he'd barely touched, and walk out. He had meetings to reschedule, a speech to write. He didn't belong here anymore. But as he reached for his wallet, April was walking toward his table again, this time with the man beside her. "James," she said, her voice steadier now. "This is my brother Tom. He's in town helping me move into a bigger place before the baby comes." Her brother, not her husband. James felt a ridiculous sense of relief wash over him. "Nice to meet you," Tom said, extending his hand. "April's told me a lot about you over the years." James shook his hand, wondering exactly what April had shared. "Good things, I hope." Tom's expression was unreadable. "Mostly." April shifted uncomfortably. "Tom, can you check on table 6? Their order should be up." When her brother walked away, April hesitated for a moment before sliding into the seat across from James. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, she said quietly. "If you want to talk." James looked at her, really looked at her. Beyond the changes of 5 years and the swell of pregnancy, he saw the woman who had once known him better than anyone else in the world. "I'd like that," he said simply. April nodded once before standing up. "I'll bring you a fresh cup of coffee. You never could stand it once it got cold." As she walked away, James realized she still remembered how he took his coffee, just as he still remembered the freckle by her eye. Some things it seemed time couldn't erase. Outside, the small town continued its slow, peaceful rhythm, unaware that in a corner of its oldest cafe, two people who had once promised each other forever were about to discover what 5 years and a lifetime of changes had done to them both. 20 minutes felt like both an instant and an eternity. James nursed his second cup of coffee, watching April move around the cafe with practiced efficiency. Despite her pregnancy, she had a certain grace to her movements, something he'd always admired about her. Even in their small apartment years ago, she'd moved with purpose, never wasting a step. The morning rush had slowed to a trickle of customers. An older couple lingered over their breakfast, heads bent close in conversation. A college student typed furiously on a laptop in the far corner, surrounded by empty espresso cups. The rhythm of the place was exactly as James remembered, yet everything had changed. Ready? He looked up to find April standing beside his table, her apron gone. She'd let her hair down and it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. A light cardigan covered her floral dress, doing little to hide her rounded belly. "Yes," James said, standing quickly. He left a $50 bill under his coffee cup, a ridiculous tip that he knew would annoy her. Old habits died hard. April noticed and rolled her eyes but said nothing. Some battles weren't worth fighting anymore. "There's a park across the street," she suggested, "if you don't mind walking." The April he remembered would have suggested they talk right there in the cafe, bold and unconcerned with privacy. This new caution around him felt strange, but he had earned it. "The park sounds perfect," he said. They walked in silence, crossing the street to the small green space that served as the town's gathering spot. Not much had changed here either. The same iron benches, the same oak trees that had been saplings when they were kids. A fresh coat of paint on the gazebo was the only sign that time had passed at all. April chose a bench near the small pond, easing herself down with a small sigh. James sat beside her, careful to leave enough space between them. "So," April said, looking out at the water rather than at him, "you're back in town." "Just for a few days," James replied. "My old professor asked me to speak at graduation." "Professor Winters?" A small smile appeared on April's face. "He still teaches that intro to programming class?" "He does. Still wears those awful sweater vests, too." They shared a genuine laugh, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to disappear. "He was at our wedding," April said quietly after the laughter faded. "He was," James agreed. "He drank all the good whiskey and tried to teach your grandmother how to do the robot." Another laugh, softer this time. "I'd forgotten about that." A comfortable silence settled between them, disturbed only by the distant laughter of children playing on the other side of the park. "You look good, April," James finally said. "You seem happy." She turned to face him fully. "Some days I am. Others not so much. That's life, isn't it?" Her honesty was refreshing. In his world of business meetings and networking events, everyone was always fantastic or crushing it. No one ever admitted to just being okay. April's hand rested on her stomach. "But this little one gives me something to look forward to every day." James nodded, his eyes drawn to her belly. The question hung in the air between them, unasked. "You're wondering about the father," April said, always able to read his thoughts. "It's none of my business," James replied quickly. "Maybe not, but you're curious." She sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "His name is David. We dated for about a year after moving back here. He's a good man, a carpenter, builds beautiful furniture." James tried to picture this David person, someone with rough hands and practical skills, so different from himself. "He doesn't know about the baby," April continued, surprising him. "He got a job offer in Seattle right before I found out. Long distance doesn't work for everyone, as we know all too well." The implied criticism wasn't lost on James. "You didn't tell him?" "I was going to. Then I found out he'd met someone else just 3 weeks after moving." She shrugged, a gesture meant to seem casual but failing to hide the hurt. "Some things aren't meant to be." "April, I'm sorry, don't be. I've made peace with it." She patted her belly gently. "It's just me and this little girl now." "A girl?" James couldn't help but smile. "You always wanted a daughter." Something flickered across April's face. Surprise, perhaps, that he remembered such a detail. "I did, still do, obviously." Another silence, less comfortable this time. "What about you?" April asked. "The magazines say you're the most eligible bachelor in tech. No supermodel girlfriend? No Silicon Valley power couple?" James shook his head. "No time. The company still comes first," April finished for him. "That's not fair," he said, though they both knew it was, isn't it? "Look at you, James. 5 years later and you're still putting everything else on hold for Pixel Core." "The company employs over 2,000 people now," he said defensively. "That's 2,000 families that depend on me making the right decisions every day." April studied him thoughtfully. "And what about your life? Who depends on you there?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. James looked away, watching a pair of ducks glide across the pond's surface. I have friends, he said lamely. I'm sure you do, April replied, her voice softening. I hope you have people who know the real you, not the CEO version, the real him. James wasn't sure who that was anymore. The line between James the person and James the founder had blurred years ago. Tell me about your life here, he said, changing the subject. You're the cafe manager now? April allowed the deflection. Owner, actually. I bought it from the Hendersons last year when they retired to Florida. Really? James couldn't hide his surprise. That's amazing, April. Don't sound so shocked, she laughed. I did learn a few things about business from you. The cafe was always special to you, he remembered. You used to say it was the heart of the town. It is, she said with quiet pride. We host community events now. Book clubs, local artist showcases, study groups for the college kids. It's not just a place for coffee anymore. As she spoke about her plans for the cafe, her face lit up with the same passion he remembered from their early days. April had always been a visionary in her own right, seeing potential where others saw only the ordinary. What about teaching? He asked. I thought that was your dream. A shadow crossed her face. It was. I taught third grade for 3 years after everything. I loved it, but when Mom got sick, I needed more flexible hours to help care for her. Your mom was sick? I didn't know. Another reminder of how completely he'd cut himself off from this place, from her. Breast cancer, April said quietly. She's in remission now, but those were tough years. You went through all that alone. It wasn't a question, but a painful realization. April met his eyes directly. I wasn't alone. I had friends, family. This town takes care of its own. The implication was clear. He hadn't been there when she needed someone most. He'd been too busy building his empire to notice the battles she was fighting. I should have been there, he said, the words inadequate but necessary. Yes, you should have, she agreed without malice. But you weren't, and I survived anyway. That's what people do, James. They adapt. They move forward. A light breeze stirred the trees around them, sending a shower of pink blossoms floating down. One landed on April's hair, and without thinking, James reached out to brush it away. His fingers grazed her temple, and they both froze at the contact. Sorry, he murmured, pulling his hand back quickly. April cleared her throat. It's fine, but it wasn't fine. Nothing about this situation was fine. Sitting here with his pregnant ex-wife, 5 years of unspoken words between them, in the town he'd been so desperate to escape, it was surreal. Why did you really come back, James? April asked suddenly. And don't say it was just for some graduation speech. The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? You could have said no to Professor Winters. You've probably turned down dozens of similar requests over the years. Why say yes to this one? Why now? James stared at the ground, watching an ant make its determined way across the path. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. I think I needed to see this place again, he finally admitted. To remember where I came from. And? April prompted. Did it help? He looked around at the small park, at the familiar storefronts visible beyond the trees, at the woman sitting beside him who had once been his whole world. I don't know yet, he answered honestly. April nodded as if his answer made perfect sense. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I need to get back. My brother's helping me paint the nursery this afternoon. Of course, James said, standing to help her up. She accepted his hand but released it quickly once she was on her feet. It was good to see you, James. Her voice held a finality that suggested she didn't expect to see him again before he left town. April, he called as she turned to go. Would it be okay if I stopped by the cafe again, before I leave town? She hesitated, weighing his request. When's your speech? Saturday. I fly out Sunday morning. Another pause. The cafe is closed on Sundays, she said. Then softer. But I'll be there doing the books. Back door will be open around 9. Before he could respond, she was walking away, one hand supporting her lower back, the other resting protectively on her belly. James watched until she disappeared around the corner, feeling like he'd been given something precious and fragile. A second chance, perhaps, though at what exactly? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that Sunday morning suddenly seemed very important, and very far away. The next few days passed in a blur for James. He spent his mornings at the university, helping with a workshop for graduating business students. His afternoons were filled with calls to his office in California. where his team seemed perpetually surprised that the world hadn't fallen apart without him physically present. "The Wilson contract is still waiting for your final approval," his assistant reminded him during their daily check-in. "And the board wants to schedule an emergency meeting about the new product launch." "Tell them I'll review everything when I get back," James replied, staring out the window of his hotel room at the familiar skyline of his hometown. Nothing so urgent it can't wait until Monday. 5 years ago, he would have dropped everything and flown back immediately. 3 days ago, he might have done the same, but something had shifted inside him since seeing April at the café. He'd returned there each morning, sitting at the same corner table. April wasn't avoiding him exactly, but she kept their interactions brief and professional. She'd nod hello, bring his coffee, and then busy herself with other customers. Her brother Tom would watch this dance from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. On Friday, James had finally gathered the courage to say more than just thank you when she brought his coffee. "How's the nursery coming along?" he'd asked. April had seemed surprised by the question. "Good, we finished the painting. Pale yellow, not pink. I'm not big on gender stereotypes." "I remember," James had said with a small smile. "You always said you'd dress a daughter in blue if she wanted." That had earned him a genuine smile, however brief. "You do have a good memory," she'd admitted before being called away to another table. Now it was Saturday evening, and James stood at a podium in the university auditorium, looking out at a sea of young, eager faces in graduation gowns. He'd given this type of speech before, the successful alumnus returning to inspire the next generation. Usually he stuck to safe topics: innovation, perseverance, the power of disruptive thinking. But tonight, as he adjusted the microphone, different words came to him. 10 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now, he began, full of ambition, impatient to leave this town behind and make my mark on the world. The standard opening. The graduates nodded, expecting the usual success story. And I did leave. I built a company valued at billions. I have an apartment overlooking the Bay Bridge and another in Manhattan. I fly private when I need to. By the metrics we're taught to value, I've succeeded beyond what that nervous kid in a rented graduation gown could have imagined. James paused, looking down at his prepared notes. Then he set them aside. But here's what they don't tell you about success. It's lonely at the top if you've left behind everyone who matters. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the inspirational pep talk they'd expected. Don't get me wrong, James continued. I'm proud of what I've built. But this week, being back in this town, I've realized something important. Success isn't just about what you achieve. It's also about what you give up to get there. From the front row, Professor Winters gave him an encouraging nod. The world will tell you that you can have it all. You can't. Every choice has a cost. Every yes to one thing is a no to something else. I said yes to my company and no to, well, to many things I'm only now realizing were equally valuable. James thought of April in the cafe, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, building a life without him. So as you leave here today, be ambitious, dream big, but remember that the spreadsheets and stock options and corner offices are tools, not destinations. They're meant to serve your life, not become it. He finished the speech to polite applause, shaking hands with faculty members who seemed slightly puzzled by his departure from the expected script. Professor Winters clapped him on the back. Not what I expected, the older man said, but perhaps what they needed to hear. Later at the reception, James checked his watch repeatedly. Tomorrow was Sunday. 9 o'clock. The cafe's back door. His last chance to what? He wasn't entirely sure. You seem distracted, Professor Winters commented, handing him a cup of punch that definitely contained more than just fruit juice. Just thinking about tomorrow, James admitted. Ah, heading back to your empire. There was no judgment in the professor's tone, just curiosity. Eventually. I have a stop to make first. Professor Winters studied him over the rim of his glasses. You know, I saw April in town the other day. She mentioned you'd been by the cafe. James shouldn't have been surprised. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone's business. We've talked a bit, he said cautiously. The professor sipped his punch. She went through a rough time after you left. Her mother's illness, the teaching job that didn't work out the way she'd hoped. She told me some of it, James said. I didn't know about any of it when it was happening. No, you wouldn't have. Professor Winters' tone remained neutral. You were busy becoming a success story I could brag about to my students. James winced at the gentle rebuke. She never stopped believing in you, you know. the professor continued. Even when people around here would talk about that big shot who left April high and dry, she'd defend you. Said you were changing the world just like you always said you would. Something tightened in James's chest. I didn't know that. Of course you didn't. April's got too much pride to tell you herself. Professor Winters drained his cup. Whatever you're planning tomorrow, just remember, she's built a good life here. On her own terms. I know that, James said quickly. I'm not trying to disrupt anything, aren't you? The professor raised an eyebrow. That's what you do for a living, isn't it? Disrupt? Before James could answer, a group of graduates approached, eager to ask questions about breaking into the tech industry. The moment for private conversation was gone, but the professor's words lingered. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. James woke early, too restless to sleep. He walked the quiet streets of his hometown, retracing paths he'd walked thousands of times in his youth. Past his old high school, past the movie theater where he'd had his first date, not with April, but with a girl whose name he could barely remember now. Past the hardware store where he and April had rented their first apartment together. The town was waking up slowly. An elderly man walked his dog, nodding politely as James passed. A teenager on a bike delivered newspapers with sleepy determination. A church bell rang in the distance. By 8:30, James found himself standing behind the cafe, staring at the plain metal door with its chipped red paint. He was half an hour early, but he couldn't bear to walk around anymore. His thoughts were too jumbled, his emotions too raw. What exactly was he hoping for here? Forgiveness? Closure? A miracle? At precisely 8:55, the door swung open. April stood there, keys in hand, looking surprised to see him already waiting. You're early, she said. Couldn't sleep, he admitted. April nodded as if she understood. Perhaps she did. Come in. I've got the coffee started. The cafe looked different from the back, less polished, more functional. A small office stood off to one side, its desk covered with papers and receipts. The kitchen was spotless, but clearly well used, with commercial-grade equipment that James suspected was new since he'd left town. April led him to a small table in the corner of the kitchen. I usually have my breakfast here while doing the books, she explained, gesturing to the laptop and stack of folders. It's quiet. It's nice, James said, meaning it. The space felt lived in, personal. April poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to him. He noticed she was drinking tea instead, some herbal blend that smelled of mint and lemon. Can't have caffeine, she explained, catching his glance. Doctor's orders. How are you feeling? He asked, nodding toward her belly. Tired, excited, terrified. April smiled ruefully. The usual, I guess. When are you due? August 12th. She ran a hand over her stomach. Though the doctor thinks she might come early, she's already dropping. James nodded as if he understood what that meant, though he had no idea. There was so much about April's life now that was foreign to him. I'm leaving today, he said after a moment. I know. April sipped her tea. Back to California. Yes. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Why did you want to see me again, James? April finally asked. After all this time? It was the same question she'd asked in the park, but now it carried more weight. This was his last chance to say whatever he'd come to say. I think, he began, then stopped, trying to find the right words. I think I needed to see what I left behind, to understand what my choices really cost. April's expression remained neutral. And what's the verdict? The cost was too high, James said quietly. I built the life I thought I wanted, but it's hollow, empty. I have everything and nothing at the same time. April's eyes softened slightly. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. It's not your burden to carry. No, she agreed. It's not. Another silence. From somewhere in the cafe, a refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car drove past, its tires swishing on the still damp morning streets. I miss you, James said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Not just now, I've missed you for 5 years. I just didn't let myself feel it. April set down her mug carefully. James, I know, he held up a hand. I'm not asking for anything. I know you've built a life here. A good life. I just needed you to know that. What exactly did you think would happen here today? April asked, her voice gentle but firm. Did you think I'd fall into your arms pregnant and all? That we'd somehow pick up where we left off? No, James said, though a small, foolish part of him had indeed hoped for some kind of miracle. I don't know what I expected. I just knew I couldn't leave town without seeing you one more time. April studied him for a long moment. You know what I think? I think you're having a midlife crisis. All that success and suddenly you're wondering if you made the right choices. Maybe, James admitted, but that doesn't make what I'm feeling any less real. April sighed, resting her hands on her belly. Life isn't a movie, James. You can't just walk back into someone's world after 5 years and expect everything to fall into place. I know that. Do you? Because it feels like you're looking for some kind of redemption story here, and I can't give you that. Her voice was kind but resolute. I've worked too hard to build this life, the cafe, the baby, my independence. I can't be the answer to your existential crisis. Her words stung, but James knew they were fair. He had waltzed back into her life, stirring up old feelings without any real plan beyond his own need for, what, absolution? Connection? You're right, he said finally. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. He stood to leave, but April's voice stopped him. I didn't say that. James turned back slowly, afraid to hope. What did you say? I said I didn't tell you not to come, April repeated, her eyes steady on his. Sit down, James, please. He lowered himself back into the chair, his heart hammering in his chest. April wrapped her hands around her mug, gathering her thoughts. You showing up like this? It's complicated. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't thought about you over the years, wondered how things might have been different. I've wondered the same thing, James said quietly. But wondering doesn't change anything, April continued. We can't go back and undo our choices. I know that, she looked at him thoughtfully. Do you remember our first apartment? That tiny place above the hardware store? James smiled at the memory. How could I forget? The floors creaked, the heating barely worked, and we could hear old Mr. Jenkins arguing with his cat at all hours. But we were happy there, April said softly. We were. I was so proud of you back then, she continued, watching you work on your ideas late into the night, seeing how your face would light up when you solved some coding problem I couldn't begin to understand. You had this fire in you. James felt a tightness in his throat. You were the only one who believed in me back then. That's not true, April corrected gently. You believed in yourself. That was always your strength, James. And your weakness. She shifted in her chair, one hand moving to support her lower back. James fought the urge to help her, knowing the gesture wouldn't be welcome. I used to think you left me, April said after a moment. But that's not really what happened, is it? You left everything, me, this town, your old life. All of it was just collateral damage in your race to the top. The words hurt, but James couldn't deny their truth. I thought I could have it all. The success and you. I thought you'd wait until I built something worth sharing with you. But life doesn't wait, James. It just keeps happening with or without you. April gestured to her pregnant belly. Case in point. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Point taken. April leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? Something I've always wondered. Anything. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, having what you have now, would you make the same choice? Would you still leave? It was the question that had haunted him since seeing her again. James took a deep breath, determined to be honest. I don't know, he admitted. The company needed me in California. It might have failed if I'd stayed here. So maybe it was the right choice for you, April said, a hint of disappointment in her voice, but, James continued, I think I could have found a middle ground. I didn't have to disappear from your life completely. I could have tried harder to make things work between us. I could have come home more often, called more, included you in that part of my life instead of compartmentalizing everything. April nodded slowly. Maybe. Or maybe we were just too young trying to build two different lives at the same time. You might be right. James ran a hand through his hair. But I wish I'd tried harder to find out. From the front of the cafe came the sound of the front door being unlocked. April glanced at her watch. That's Becky, my Sunday manager. She'll handle the books today so I can finish setting up the nursery. Reality crashed back in. James had a flight to catch. April had a baby coming and a life that didn't include him. I should go, he said, standing again. This time April didn't stop him, but as he turned to leave, she spoke again. The back door sticks sometimes. Push hard at the bottom. James nodded, heading for the exit. The door did indeed stick, requiring a firm shove before it swung open to the alley behind the cafe. He was halfway through when April called his name once more. "James, the cafe opens at 7 tomorrow. If your flight isn't too early." He turned back surprised. "It's at 11, April nodded. "Good. Maybe we can have breakfast before you go, as friends." "Friends," James repeated, testing the word. It wasn't what he wanted, not really, but it was more than he deserved. "I'd like that." "Good." She offered a small smile. "Goodbye, James. See you tomorrow, April." The door closed behind him with a soft click. James stood in the alley for a moment, processing what had just happened. They hadn't resolved anything, not really, but something had shifted between them. Some small door had opened where before there had only been a wall. Friends. It was a start. Maybe the only start possible under the circumstances. As James walked back to his hotel, his phone buzzed with messages from his assistant about Monday meetings and pending decisions. For the first time in years, he silenced the notifications without reading them. Instead, he called the airline and changed his flight from 11 to 4. A few extra hours wouldn't change anything in California, but here, in this small town with April, they might make all the difference. Monday morning arrived clear and bright. James woke early, packed his single suitcase, and checked out of the hotel. By 6:45, he was standing outside the cafe, watching as April unlocked the front door. She looked surprised to see him. "You're early again." "Bad habit," he admitted with a smile. April returned the smile, gesturing him inside. "Come on, help me set up." For the next 15 minutes, James followed April's instructions, wiping down tables, arranging chairs, filling sugar containers. It was simple work, far removed from the complex business decisions that usually filled his mornings, but there was something satisfying about it. "You're not bad at this," April commented as she showed him how to prepare the coffee machines. "I might have to hire you." "The pay's probably better than my current job," James joked. "I doubt that." April's tone was light, but her eyes were curious. "How much does a tech CEO make these days anyway?" James mentioned a figure that made April whistle low under her breath. "And yet here you are, filling sugar bowls in a small-town cafe," she mused. "Turns out money doesn't fill sugar bowls on its own," James replied, "or do much of anything else that actually matters." April gave him a long look but said nothing. By 7, the cafe was ready to open. A few early customers trickled in, mostly regulars who greeted April by name and gave James curious glances. Word had clearly spread about the return of the hometown boy who'd made it big. "Let's eat," April said once the initial rush had been served. She led him to a small table in the corner. Not the same one where they'd talked yesterday, but close enough. They ordered breakfast from Becky, pancakes for James, oatmeal with fruit for April. As they waited for their food, a comfortable silence settled between them. "So," April said finally, "what happens now?" James had been asking himself the same question all night. "I go back to California. You stay here. We both get on with our lives." April nodded, her expression unreadable. "And that's it? The end of the story?" "I don't think so," James said carefully. "Not if you don't want it to be." "What does that mean exactly?" James took a deep breath. He'd rehearsed this in his head a dozen times since yesterday, but now that the moment had come, the words felt inadequate. "It means I'd like to keep in touch. Really keep in touch, not just holiday cards or social media updates. Regular calls, visits when possible. As friends," April clarified. "Yes," James agreed, though his heart whispered otherwise. "As friends." Becky arrived with their food, temporarily halting the conversation. When she left, April poured maple syrup over her oatmeal. A habit James remembered from their married days that had always struck him as strange but endearing. "I have conditions," April said, stirring her breakfast. "First, no grand gestures. No sending expensive gifts or trying to solve my problems with your money. I've managed on my own this long." "Agreed," James said, though the urge to help her financially was strong. The cafe was successful, but a baby was expensive and single motherhood wouldn't be easy. "Second, no promises you can't keep. If you say you'll call on Tuesday at 7, you call on Tuesday at 7. If something comes up, you let me know in advance. I've had enough disappointment for one lifetime." James winced at the implied criticism but nodded. "I can do that." And third, April continued, her voice softening slightly, you have to understand that my daughter comes first now. Always. My schedule, my priorities, my decisions, they all revolve around her. I wouldn't expect anything else, James said sincerely. April studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. Okay then, friends. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Around them, the cafe hummed with morning activity. The hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversations, the clinking of silverware against plates. What will you tell people at work? April asked suddenly. About why you're calling some random woman in your hometown? James smiled. The truth, that I'm reconnecting with an old friend. And your girlfriend? Or boyfriends? April added with a raised eyebrow. I don't want to step on any toes. There's no one, James assured her. There hasn't been anyone serious since... Well, since you, April looked skeptical. In 5 years? I find that hard to believe, James shrugged. Believe what you want. It's the truth. The famous James Taylor, most eligible bachelor in tech, living like a monk. The tabloids would be disappointed. The tabloids don't know anything real about me, James said with a hint of bitterness. Neither does anyone else, really. April's expression softened. That sounds lonely. It is, he admitted. But it's also my own doing. April reached across the table and, for the first time since he'd returned, touched his hand voluntarily. The contact was brief, just a gentle squeeze, but it sent warmth spreading through his chest. For what it's worth, she said, I think friendship is a good place to start. For both of us. Start. The word hung in the air between them, full of possibility. My flight's at 4, James said, glancing at his watch. It was only 9:30, I know. April smiled. Want to help me finish the nursery? My brother was supposed to help put together the crib, but he got called into work. Turns out I'm not great with an Allen wrench. James felt a rush of unexpected joy. A few more hours with April. Doing something normal, something helpful. I'd love to. Fair warning, April said as they gathered their things. If you think coding is hard, wait till you try to decipher Swedish furniture instructions. James laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. I think I'm up for the challenge. As they left the cafe together, James realized that for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't thinking about his company, his responsibilities, or his success. He was thinking about April, about a crib that needed assembling, and about the unexpected turn his life had taken when he walked into a cafe and saw his ex-wife again. He didn't know where this new path might lead, but for now it was enough to simply walk it together. 3 months passed in a blur of video calls, text messages, and the occasional care package sent cross-country. True to his word, James had kept in touch, calling when he said he would, never missing their Sunday evening check-ins. For her part, April had been open but cautious, sharing details of her life while maintaining the boundaries she'd established. The doctor says everything looks perfect, she told him during their latest video call, tilting the phone to show off her now enormous belly. Just 3 more weeks to go, supposedly. Are you ready? James asked from his office in San Francisco. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a stunning view of the bay and the city skyline. As ready as anyone can be, April replied with a nervous laugh. The nursery's done. I've got more tiny clothes than she'll ever wear, and my mom's planning to stay with me for the first 2 weeks. That's good, James said. You shouldn't be alone. A brief silence fell between them, comfortable but laden with unspoken thoughts. How are things at the cafe? James asked finally. April brightened. Actually, really good. That new coffee supplier you recommended has been a game changer. Better product, better price. I'm glad, James said, pleased that at least one of his suggestions had been accepted. April had politely but firmly declined his offers of financial help, accepting only his business advice. And that college student I hired to manage our social media has brought in a whole new crowd. We're actually having to turn people away during the lunch rush. That's fantastic, April. She nodded, then winced suddenly, pressing a hand to her side. What's wrong? James asked, instantly concerned. Nothing, April assured him. Just Braxton Hicks contractions. Been having them all week. Should you be working? Maybe you should take some time off before the baby comes. April rolled her eyes. Don't you start? I've got my brother and my mom saying the same thing. The cafe keeps me busy, keeps my mind off the waiting. If you say so. James said doubtfully. But promise you'll call me if anything happens? Anytime, day or night. I promise, April said softly. Now tell me about your week. How did that big meeting go? The one with the investors from Japan? James launched into an explanation of the meeting, noting how April listened intently despite probably understanding only half of the technical details. She'd always been like that, genuinely interested in his work even when it went over her head. When they hung up an hour later, James sat back in his chair, staring out at the darkening sky. 3 months of regular contact had eased something in him, filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged was there, yet it had also sharpened a different kind of pain, the awareness of how far apart their lives still were. His assistant poked her head into his office. Your car's ready, Mr. Taylor. The dinner with the board starts in 40 minutes. Thanks, Diane. James gathered his things, pushing thoughts of April aside. For now, at least, this was still his reality. Board meetings and investor dinners, strategy sessions and product launches. But increasingly, it felt like he was living a double life. Here in California, he was James Taylor, tech CEO, the driven founder who never took his eye off the prize. But in his calls with April, he was just James, the man who laughed at her stories about demanding customers, who offered advice on the cafe's accounting software, who listened to her fears about motherhood. He wondered sometimes, which version was more real? The call came at 3 a.m, 2 weeks later. James fumbled for his phone in the darkness of his bedroom, his heart racing when he saw April's name on the screen. April? What's wrong? Her voice was tight with pain. My water broke. The contractions are 5 minutes apart. Tom's driving me to the hospital now. James was instantly alert, sitting up and switching on the lamp. Is it too early? I thought you had another week. Apparently she's impatient, April said, then gasped as another contraction hit. James, I'm scared. Everything's going to be fine, he assured her, though his own stomach was knotted with worry. You're strong, April. You've got this. Will you? Will you stay on the phone? At least until we get to the hospital? Of course, James said without hesitation. I'm right here. For the next 20 minutes, he talked her through each contraction, reminded her to breathe, distracted her with silly stories from their college days. When they finally reached the hospital, April's brother Tom took the phone. They're taking her in now, he told James. I'll call you when there's news. Wait, James said quickly. Tell her. Tell her I'm thinking of her. Tell her she's not alone. I will, Tom promised before hanging up. James sat in the semi-darkness of his bedroom, the phone still clutched in his hand. 3,000 miles away, April was bringing new life into the world, and all he could do was wait. Making a sudden decision, he got out of bed and went to his laptop. Within minutes, he had booked a flight to April's hometown. It left in 4 hours, just enough time to pack and get to the airport. He called Diane, waking her up to explain his sudden departure. Reschedule everything for the next week, he instructed. Tell the board it's a family emergency. A family emergency? Diane repeated, confusion clear in her voice. In 5 years, James had never mentioned any family beyond a distant cousin in Seattle. Yes, James said firmly. That's exactly what it is. The hospital corridor seemed endless as James followed a nurse toward the maternity ward. He'd flown all night, rented a car at the airport, and driven straight here, running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee. She's in room 312, the nurse told him. The baby was born about 6 hours ago. Both mother and daughter are doing well. Thank you, James said, his voice rough with emotion. He paused outside the door, suddenly uncertain. What if April didn't want him here? What if she saw his arrival as an intrusion, a violation of the careful boundaries they'd established? Before he could decide whether to knock or retreat, the door opened and Tom stepped out. He stopped short at the sight of James. You're here, he said, surprise evident in his voice. You actually came. I had to, James said simply. Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. She's awake. The baby's sleeping. He stepped aside, holding the door open in clear invitation. James entered the room quietly. April was propped up in the hospital bed, looking exhausted but radiant. In a clear bassinet beside her lay a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. April's eyes widened when she saw him. James, what are you doing here? I couldn't stay away, he admitted, moving closer to the bed. Not for this. For a moment, April just stared at him. Then, to his immense relief, she smiled. A tired but genuine smile that reached her eyes. I can't believe you flew all this way.